Welcome to a cup of coffee here at Unchange. Joining me is Allison Van Schie. Allison, how are you today?
I'm good. Good to be with you.
Right, so Allison, you, from what I hear, have a very interesting story to tell us. You've been working with your clients for quite some time, and I believe your experiences in recent years largely revolved around implementing changes in rapid growth, in times of rapid growth. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
All right. What was the nature
So
of your change?
the nature of the change in this instance was a rapidly growing organization. So on the surface, it's like a wonderful problem to have. If your organization is growing rapidly, why would that pose a problem? But interestingly enough, it posed a number of challenges. And it's been pretty eventful and exciting going through that process and learning through the journey of this particular organization, some of the things some of the areas where change management can really add a lot of value.
So you have a particular case in mind? If so, what industry was that organization operating in?
Although I think strangely enough, that wasn't necessarily seen right from the outset. It was a
Oh,
matter of we need to make these changes for the sake of the organization. The organization is growing, but the awareness that the team that's involved is directly interfacing with the clients. So it was quite interesting because there's so much that gets transmitted to the clients unconsciously or
yeah.
subtly. So I think when you're dealing in a services industry, one of the things that this highlighted was the importance of having your people on board because they're your front line. So you're not in that situation where if your people aren't really on board with the change, well, probably no one's really going to know about it. In the services industry, people know about it, even if they're not quite sure what they're picking up, if it's feeling a little bit prickly.
Oh, fair enough. So what precisely was the nature of the change? What was changing? Or was that not really well defined in your case?
So what was changing was the roles and responsibilities. I suppose you could say the organizational structure was changing. And that was simply to accommodate the growth, is that the current structure that was working needed to be expanded, which is a good thing
Mm.
because it means opportunities for new people, opportunities for the existing team, but they'd outgrown the current structure. So that was the one thing that needed to change. And the stimulus for that was looking at the internal teams and saying, people aren't managing with the work volumes anymore because by default growth means that people are struggling, are going to be under more pressure, they're taking on more responsibilities, and there was a concern that the standards that the organization was known for possibly wouldn't be achieved with the existing team and the existing structure.
Okay, all right. That's an interesting challenge, especially in times of growth. But we're living in times where growth might even just mean survival. Um,
Absolutely.
so
And I
um,
think if you look at it in current times, it's still very relevant because businesses might not be growing in terms of expansion, but they definitely are looking at their structures, at their
yeah,
roles and responsibilities,
and there's
and
bound to be
how
some restructuring involved.
absolutely in terms of being able to redeploy people. And that's effectively what even growth takes redeployment. So redeployment of people can happen in contraction and it can also happen in growth. So I think it's equally valuable.
Now, as your role as a change manager in that organization, I know you were discussing here a client of yours. Um, as your role within that function of managing the change of this organizational restructure, how did you find working in such tight timelines, such tight areas?
So that was one of the challenges because everything was already happening and things were happening now. So there wasn't that luxury of well, let's sit down and think about it and meet again next week. It was all very much in process and moving along very quickly. So that in itself posed some challenges.
About
But
how long? A couple of months, a year?
we're probably
Quickly is
looking
a
at
relative
about
term.
probably about 6 months all in all
Wow.
that it
Okay.
happened. But it was constant and ongoing during that time phrase, or during that time phase, is that there was always something happening.
Well, as change managers often say, sponsorship is the primary cause of a project success or otherwise. What was it like in your case? Did you have a
So
strong leadership? Was there a particular person you could point to that spearheaded the project?
the initial change was driven by the CEO. So the CEO and the department head that I worked with, in this case, had mutually decided that things needed to change, that people were being stretched, that these quality and standards were potentially at risk if people weren't able to manage the current volumes and the current working parameters. So they'd mutually come to an agreement that something needed to change.
Okay, so it was an organizational restructure in a very tight timeline that still had it had a strong leadership in the sense of it was the CEO that was leading the charge, as it were.
Yes.
But what you're telling me is that it's more around, from what I'm getting here, it's more around making sure that the roles themselves have changed, and you need the people to change with the roles, or are you changing the people entirely, as in a new set of people?
So that was a little bit undetermined at the outset. It was a matter of, well, let's have a look and see what needs to change. So if we're looking at, the process had started off looking at the benchmarks and the standards that the organization needed to uphold. So what were the things that were important to the organization to achieve? And once we defined those and we said, okay, we're going to be working on these particular areas, then it was a matter of let's have a look at what we have currently. And that was the team that I was working with. So we have this team who's performing a number of different roles and functions. And these are the ones that we've highlighted that are being outgrown or are being stretched. And from that perspective, the organization then had a look and said, well, what could we do to make those processes and roles simpler and easier? And I think the key thing that came out of it was that the processes were looked at and the tools and the structure was looked at, but the people were left behind to an extent. And I think what was interesting about what happened in that circumstance was that initially the entire team appeared to be on board. And that's possibly why it was that assumption that was made almost unknowingly. Well, okay, we've got the team on board, so this should be a fairly easy change. And yet it turned out that it wasn't.
Yeah, but it's an example of where processes and systems and all the technological bits around the project side of the change was managed, but not necessarily the people within it. So, as the change manager in dealing with all these challenges, a very tight deadline, lots of knock on changes, one change after the next, you're almost spurring on more changes as it goes. What was your approach to managing the people side of change, which you've so far indicated that it was, in a sense, neglected and created some resistance?
So my approach was I was working with the department head and of the team most impacted by change. And my approach was to have a look at where the team was in the context of the ADCAR model. So that meant, had the team, were they aware of the change? Was the desire there? It was really just a matter of getting an understanding of where the team was at in terms of the change that they were being involved in.
Okay, so you're looking at the team that was implementing the change, or the team that was the receiver of the change, as it were?
The team that was the receiver of the change. So they were the team that was most impacted, and that's where some of the challenges were coming in, was because this team needs to go ahead and run with the change, and there's certain things that are not happening the way that the way that we'd expected, or there were certain things that weren't anticipated that were coming up as challenges within this team that
Such as?
needed to be addressed. So I think the biggest challenge was that on the surface, everybody appeared to be on board. And that was what made it actually quite interesting, was this was a team who was willing to be part of change. They were quite used to change because that was the nature of the organization. And yet, for this particular change, it was just causing disruption in every area. And the interesting part was that, yes, they were aware of the change and people had the desire to be on board. So then the question was, why wasn't the change rolling out smoothly? Because that was the expectation.
So what did you learn from all this? I mean, having had to deal with the challenges that you've outlined here, was the project relatively successful, would you say?
It was. I think the biggest thing that we learned and what we needed to work on immediately was when you look in the ADKAR model and you look at desire. So this is the area where we found we actually had more work to do than what we'd anticipated. So on the surface, yes, the team wanted to be part of the change. What came out and what we learned from it was that it's also about the importance of communication. That was the first thing. And the second thing that we learned was the importance of understanding the role of the manager in driving the change within a team. So, what had happened in this situation was that the department head was on board for the change and bringing their team on board with the change. But the lack of clear and transparent communication and open, regular communication created an environment of mistrust. And over a period of time, that started to erode the change that was being driven. So, what we learned through this process was the real value of communication and understanding that desire is not really a box that you tick once and walk away from it and say, okay, everybody's on board for this. And we saw very clearly that the department head and the CEO had a different perception about what the future state was going to be. And that actually probably was the heart of the breakdown, was although they were both on board for the change journey, they were heading to a slightly different future state in both of their minds.
So when we talk about the sponsor or the sponsors, the team comprised of people who reported to multiple sponsors, is that correct? The impacted group comprised of people impacted, led by different sponsors, is that correct?
To clarify that, the team impacted was led by the department head, and the department head reported into the CEO.
Ah, okay. All right. So it almost sounds like there's a sponsor coalition at play where the CEO had one idea, trying to communicate it down to the department head. The department head instead had a different idea. So he signed on at first, and then as things evolved, as he became more aware of the consequences of the change, he drifted off from wanting this change to happen. Is that correct? Is that an accurate assessment?
Yes, that is pretty much what happened. When the CEO and the department head initially discussed the change, where they were both going to probably wasn't very clearly defined. So both parties walked away with a different perception of what the outcome of the change was going to be. And part of that was that the CEO was very much but we can't necessarily define the change. We can't put it in concrete and say it's going to be X, Y, and Z. We need to have a more flexible, agile approach and let this unfold as it happens.
It's interesting that you mentioned Agile in there. I was about to say, this is often what we see in changes that are taking place in an Agile environment, where you define a future state and you go for that change, and that change has a knock-on effect on other changes and so on and so forth. So given the nature of this change, it sounds like almost it was a small team of people that was impacted, or was this a large organizational change which had impacts on multiple groups of people?
It was primarily one team that was being impacted. And the interesting thing there was that then the impact resonated through the entire team because they were the primary recipient of change, whereas the rest of the organization was still continuing as normal. So in a way, that brought some unique challenges because it created a little bit of a sense of isolation.
You said something very interesting there. The fact that that impact affected only them made them feel isolated. Is that right?
Yes.
Oh, that's an aspect of change we don't often hear, especially for changes that, as I understand, have knock-on effects. In your case, you had a change that essentially kept evolving into a new change, right?
Yes,
Okay.
absolutely. So the reason that I use the word isolated is because I think when the entire organization is going through a change, you've got different challenges than when you've only got one pocket of the organization going through change. That said, the rest of the way that change was structured in this particular organization was with a silo approach. So the approach that they took was when the business grows, there's different departments that are being impacted. So they took the approach that change happens in, let's say, the sales department, and we'll deal with their change. Then it's going to happen in the delivery teams department, so then we'll deal with their change. Then it's going to happen in the operational department, and we'll deal with their change. And that silo approach actually created that feeling of isolation.
Yeah.
Because it meant that everybody literally was like, oh, the change is coming our way now, it's our turn. A little bit like going to the dentist. You've kind of been in the waiting room and watching everybody else go through it, and now
Yeah.
you're being called and it's your turn, you're up. And that for me was an interesting observation because the silo approach just meant that the teams being involved as they were going through it were really experienced high levels of anxiety because it was going to be in, out, get it done, and move on. So there was a feeling of anxiety that this is something our team has to manage, and when it's done, we better be on board because the next silo is going to be worked on. And kind of where then the box is ticked, we're going to be left alone. But that actually had its own challenges because you don't just do change and then move on to the next thing and assume that there's no reinforcement needed or any additional support that needs to be given to sustain the change. And I think that's one of the disadvantages of a more silo approach.
Yeah. Okay. Wow. Okay. So I mean, there's always different approaches to every problem.
Yeah.
I have an old friend who used to say there's more than one way to skin a cat.
Yes.
I never really quite understood it until I got into the working world myself and saw those different approaches applied in the same way you're describing. You've got one change affecting many silos, but instead of managing it as one unified change where everyone within the organization, all the silos are going through it and everyone's aware of it and everyone is working together on getting through that change. It's rather, here's your change, go. Here's your change, go. Here's your change, go. Yeah. Hindsight, as they say, is always 2020.
Absolutely.
In hindsight, how would you have tackled that differently? Would you have suggested, for example, to the CEO that the change should be managed as one large change, and the actual impacted groups is not this team for this change, this team for this change, but it's actually all these teams for this one change.
I don't know that I necessarily would have said to them, you need to involve the entire organization in going through change at one time, because I think there are advantages, and we saw some advantages through looking at each department on their own. I mean, it means that you can focus. In some ways, you get the change done and managed without dragging it out, and I think that there are some benefits to that. Think that there's nothing worse when you know something's going to change, but it just never seems to actually happen. So there were some advantages to the approach that they took. It meant that they plowed resources, financial resources, time and effort into addressing the problems being faced by this particular team before moving on to the next area. The key thing the key aspect that was overlooked, though, was the awareness and the acknowledgement that if you change something in one area of the organization, they don't live in a silo, and it is going to have a knock-on effect somewhere else. And that was the part that had been overlooked. So when the impacts of certain things were changing within that silo, that acknowledgement that I'm sure you've heard of Newton's cradle. It's that those balls that you pull on the side and then they resonate. That's what was missing, is that if you pull this one and you drop it, it might not smash the rest of the balls out of the cradle, but it is going to reverberate all the way through into different parts of the organization. And so what happened as a result of taking this very silo approach was that people became defensive of their roles within their silo. So if something wasn't working, we've made a change in this team, but we haven't acknowledged that it may have an impact somewhere else, and giving, again, the communication, then let's allow those two silos to talk to each other and say, hey, you did that, but actually it's created this for us. And how do we manage that, or what do we need to address to smooth that out again? It was more an approach of, well, that's changed and it's got nothing to do with anybody else. And that built up a lot of tension and frustration and created that isolation.
Okay, so when you built your when you built your change plans, hindsight being what it is, when you built your change plans, did you see that problem coming? And if so, what did you do to mitigate them? What did you build into your plans to mitigate the effect of this siloed approach, this risk rather of the siloed approach?
Yeah. So we did a couple of things. So the key thing that we looked at was communication, because in this particular organization, that was one of the things that was severely lacking. And it was about looking at who was impacted by change within the silos, but also in the bigger picture of the organization, and getting an understanding of the impact of change and what needed to be communicated in terms of that to the rest of the organization. And it wasn't a long and complicated process. It was simply a matter of acknowledging that no one department works in isolation of any of the others. So it was about creating and identifying who the relevant people were that needed to be informed, so that the right people were informed. That if this silo had undergone a change and they then found that, let's say, the operations side of the business wasn't coming to the party to what they now required as a result of the change, then who was the right person to be speaking to and to bring in and say, right, this team has had this particular change in a system or a technology, and as a result, it means that the information that we get from you is no longer serving its purpose. So how do we then address those two puzzle pieces? How do we fit them together again? Because we kind of broke them through
Understood.
making a change.
Yeah.
and now we need to bring you back in, and this is what we require from your department. What do you require from us? That was really the heart of it, and it came down to communication, because what was happening was the communication going backwards and forth was very much it was finger pointing to a certain extent, and there was a lot of frustration because the perception was that's a silo and there's a wall there that we can't penetrate to be able to join those two pieces of the puzzle together again now that they've landed up being broken.
You know, it almost sounds like you took one big change and broke it up into the little pieces so that each silo could be managed separately, which obviously does have its advantages as well. It's almost like you created a portfolio of changes that you had to manage, but you were managing each change individually without looking at the bigger picture, without looking at the portfolio views. Is that an
Yes.
accurate assessment? Do you think that's fair?
Yeah, I'd say that that is fair.
Okay. All right. Okay. So in future, tackling this kind of change would probably necessitate a portfolio view of changes, especially if you're going to approach it from a siloed perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the key takeaways was realizing the value of seeing change as something that has a knock-on effect. And because of that, it means that it's going to encompass or impact different areas of the organization. So when you come from the perspective of this is what we need to do, what we need to change, the value of also looking at the impact of that change and not just once off. So it wasn't sufficient to look at it in the beginning and say, well, who's going to be impacted? Oh, this silo is going to be impacted. There actually needs to be a broader approach to take a step back and say, if we make changes within that silo, what is going to happen in the rest of the organization?
Absolutely. I tip my coffee to you. Very, very, very true indeed. Well,
Yeah.
thank you so much for joining us, Allison. We'll probably see you again very soon. Um, this is a fascinating topic, especially when we talk about taking changes and breaking them up into pieces and pulling them back into one unified view again. So I'm sure we'll talk again very, very soon. Thank you so much, Allison.
Absolutely.
All the best.
Look forward to it. Thanks, Nick.